The Dark Crystal wasn't just another fantasy. It was Jim Henson's strangest gamble, a fairy tale built to frighten instead of comfort. But behind the puppets and the prophecy, it was pain stitched into every frame. Puppetry was pure torture for the people trapped inside. A snowstorm stranded Henson and sparked the world of Thra. And years later, the Skeksis didn't just stay on screen, they invaded Farscape. These are 20 weird facts about the Dark Crystal. And buried in the shadows of Thra, it began with Henson's boldest choice: to throw children straight into the dark. This wasn't just fantasy, it was darkness pulled to life by strings. Number 1. Jim Henson, the gentle dreamer behind Kermit the Frog, shocked his team when he said he didn't want the Dark Crystal to comfort children. He wanted it to scare them. Henson believed stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival lessons. If kids could face monsters in a theater, they could face fears in real life. So instead of playful Muppets, he built the Skeksis, vulture-like tyrants with rotting flesh and shrieking voices. Instead of a safe fantasy, he created Thra, a dying world poisoned by greed. Even the heroes felt fragile. Jen and Kira weren't mighty warriors. They were small, hunted, and almost powerless. Victory was never guaranteed. Henson knew he was risking his reputation. Parents expected another Sesame Street, not nightmare puppets. But he pressed on. He believed children could handle darkness, and maybe even needed it. The result wasn't a cozy bedtime story. It was a cinematic trial by fire, a fairy tale forged from fear, designed to leave its mark. Number 2. On screen, the Dark Crystal feels alive. Every twitch, every blink convincing you Thra is real. But for the performers inside those creations, it was torment. The Skeksis weren't just costumes, they were fortresses. One puppeteer trapped inside the hulking body, others on hidden radio controls to move the head, the claws, the eyes. To see where they were walking, the operators strapped little TV monitors to their chests, squinting through static. The mystics were worse. Their hunched, lumbering shapes weighed so much that performers collapsed after 10 seconds. Between takes, they staggered out gasping, drenched in sweat. Even Jen and Kira, the delicate Gelflings, were punishing. Puppeteers shuffled on their knees to simulate a childlike stride, their legs burning under hot studio lamps. Audiences marveled at the fantasy, but for the people inside, every scene was survival. Thra looked magical on film, but backstage it was pain stitched into every frame. Number 3. In March 1982, the Dark Crystal had its first preview screening, and it was a disaster. Jim Henson, determined to make his world feel alien, had insisted the Skeksis speak in their own guttural language, untranslated. Audiences sat in silence, baffled and frustrated. They couldn't follow the story, and they hated it. Universal executives panicked. They wanted changes, safer edits, maybe even new hands on the film. Henson made concessions, cutting 20 minutes, redubbing the Skeksis in English, but still, the studio wavered. They didn't believe. So Henson did something few creators ever dared. He bought the film back with his own money. Millions were on the line, but he refused to let the Dark Crystal be taken away. He released it exactly as he intended, no compromises. The gamble nearly broke him, but it also proved his faith. The Dark Crystal wasn't just a movie. It was Henson's vision, rescued by the man who believed in Thra when no one else would. Number 4. In early drafts, Jen and Kira looked nothing like the heroes we know. Their skin and hair were bright blue, an alien palette that made them look otherworldly. Tests proved unsettling. The designs looked too strange, too cold, too hard for audiences to connect with. So Henson and designer Brian Froud reworked them. They softened the features, added warmth, and made them more human in shape and tone. Jen and Kira still felt ethereal, but they looked familiar enough to invite empathy. It was a quiet pivot that saved the film. If the original blue versions had stayed, audiences might have felt like they were watching Na'vi decades before Avatar. Beautiful, but distant. Instead, the Gelflings carried a fragile humanity that made Thra's fight for survival matter. Number 5. Jim Henson's first vision for the Skeksis wasn't just grotesque monsters. They were meant to embody sin itself. There would be 7 of them, each tied to one of the deadly sins. The Chamberlain as envy, whispering with jealous spite. The Ornamentalist as lust, obsessed with appearances. The Gourmand as gluttony, devouring every meal with grotesque abandon. But as the world of Thra expanded, the cast of creatures grew beyond 7. Sins began to overlap, roles blurred, and the symbolic idea was abandoned. What remained was something more primal, a species so corrupt that they didn't need labels. That's why the Skeksis feel like more than costumes. They're excess and corruption given flesh, monsters that don't just look vile, they are vice, clawing for survival as their world rots with them. Number 6. Fsgig, Kira's furry sidekick, began as one of Brian Froud's sketches, a puffball with teeth. But it was Frank Oz who turned the drawing into chaos incarnate. Already the voice of Miss Piggy and Yoda, Oz grabbed the puppet and filled it with shrieks, barks, and snarls that weren't scripted at all. On set, Fsgig's outbursts broke the tension. Amid towering Skeksis and heavy mysticism, he was the wild card, loyal, loud, and unpredictable. His furious yelps weren't on paper. They were born from Oz riffing in the moment. Without him, the film might have been too heavy. With him, it breathed. Audiences had a tiny ball of rage to love. Number 7. The Skeksis' most terrifying soldiers weren't born in a nightmare. They were born at the dinner table. After a lobster feast, designer Brian Froud studied the cracked shells and saw something lurking in the fragments: curved armor, jagged claws, spindly legs. He sketched the shapes, twisting seafood into monstrosities, until the Garthim took form, living tanks that scuttled with insect speed and crustacean menace. The costumes were torture, 70-pound suits that trapped performers inside until they nearly collapsed. Between takes, crew hung the puppeteers on racks like carcasses, giving them a chance to breathe. But the suffering paid off. On screen, the Garthim didn't just walk, they swarmed, overwhelming heroes with unstoppable force. Decades later, their jagged silhouette still echoes in dark fantasy art, video games, and creature design. They began as lobster shells on a plate. They ended as icons carved into pop culture's nightmares. Number 8. Jim Henson knew the difference between a puppet and a character came down to one detail: the eyes. For the Dark Crystal, every set of eyes was handmade glass, designed to blink, dart, and shift like something alive. Tiny mechanisms inside allowed subtle movements, the kind you don't even notice until you realize they're what make Thra believable. Without that detail, the Gelflings would have looked like dolls, the mystics like mannequins. With it, they carried weight and soul. Henson demanded that every creature, no matter how small, had eyes that seemed to look back at you. It was painstaking work, but it's why decades later, fans still feel unsettled when the Skeksis leer, or strangely moved when Kira blinks. In Thra, the eyes aren't glass, they're alive. Number 9. The film's big twist reveals the Skeksis and the Mystics as two halves of a single race, split when the crystal cracked, only to reunite when it was healed. But Henson planted the clues early. When the Emperor dies, so does the Mystic Master, at the exact same moment. Their staffs carry the same designs, carved with mirrored patterns. Designer Brian Froud called it a broken Ouroboros, a serpent eating its tail, torn into halves. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The Skeksis represented corruption and hunger. The Mystics represented patience and restraint. Neither could survive without the other. When they fuse in the finale, it isn't a victory, it's balance restored, a cosmic correction that the story had been whispering all along. Number 10. The world of Thra didn't begin in a studio. It began in silence and in snow. In 1978, Jim Henson and his daughter Cheryl were stranded in New York by a blizzard. Flights canceled, streets buried, they were stuck in a hotel room with nothing but time. Most people would have watched TV or waited it out. Henson pulled out a notebook. Page after page, he filled it with sketches. Skeletal vultures that would become the Skeksis, gentle giants who would evolve into mystics, and fragments of myth about a crystal that bound a world together. Cheryl later recalled watching her father's hand move non-stop, as if the storm outside had cracked open a door inside his imagination. That snowstorm could have been wasted hours. Instead, it was the spark of a legend. Without it, there might never have been Thra. Fans don't just owe the film to Henson's vision, they owe it to a night when the world stopped and a dream took flight. Number 11. Even the title of the Dark Crystal was an accident. When Jim Henson first described his vision to designer Brian Froud, he spoke of a chrysalis, an insect cocoon, fragile but powerful, holding the spark of transformation. Froud, inspired by the word, sketched luminous shards instead, imagining a crystal glowing with energy. Henson misread the intent. He thought the crystal was the idea, and he liked it better. The cocoon was abandoned. The crystal stayed. Still, Henson worried that the crystal sounded flat, too ordinary, so he added one word, a single stroke that changed everything: dark. That slip gave the film its edge. The world of Thra wasn't just mystical, it was shadowed, broken, ominous. A misheard word became the name of a legend. Sometimes fantasy doesn't come from careful design. Sometimes it comes from a mistake that refuses to be corrected. Number 12. Jim Henson discovered Brian Froud through a single book, Fairies, a collection of eerie, earth-soaked illustrations convinced Henson that this was the artist who could design Thra. A decade later, Froud's fingerprints were everywhere. The Skeksis' rotting elegance, the Mystics' weathered grace, the Podlings' rustic charm, all drawn from his twisted folklore style. Froud didn't just design costumes. He shaped an entire world. Even the landscapes, from fungal forests to stone-carved ruins, echoed his art. When you watch The Dark Crystal, you're not just seeing puppets move. You're walking through Brian Froud's imagination, brought to life frame by frame. Number 13. The Dark Crystal bombed with audiences, but its influence? It spread like wildfire through Hollywood. Guillermo del Toro called it a cornerstone of his imagination, proof that puppetry could carry myth and horror with equal weight. Peter Jackson's team on The Lord of the Rings pointed to it as validation that practical creatures could stand beside humans without breaking the illusion. And it didn't stop there. Video game and comic artists borrowed its earthy textures, fungal forests, and grotesque villains for decades. What the box office dismissed as a curiosity, creators embraced as a manifesto. Henson's gamble proved fantasy didn't need polished princes or CGI armies. It just needed vision and the courage to trust puppets with the weight of myth. Audiences caught up later, but the filmmakers, they never doubted it. Number 14. Nearly 4 decades after the original film, The Dark Crystal returned, bigger than ever. In 2019, Netflix released Age of Resistance, a prequel series that built on Jim Henson's vision with hundreds of handmade puppets and almost no CGI. Producers called it the biggest puppet production ever. Armies of Skeksis marched again. Gelflings soared on land striders, and entire clans filled the world of Thra. Brian Froud returned with his family to redesign creatures, making the show a generational collaboration. Though Netflix canceled it after 1 season, fans hailed it as proof that Henson's methods still had power in the digital age. For a moment, puppetry rivaled the spectacle of modern blockbusters, and Jim Henson's dream came alive for a new audience. Number 15. The Skeksis didn't stay buried in storage after The Dark Crystal. A decade later, fans watching the sci-fi series Farscape noticed something uncanny. The alien Holosians looked suspiciously like Skeksis. That wasn't coincidence. It was resurrection. The original Skeksis puppet frameworks, still sitting in Henson's archives, were dusted off and reworked for the show. New paint, new costumes, but underneath, they were the same rotting vulture lords that once ruled Thra. It wasn't theft, it was family business. Farscape was produced by Jim Henson Television, with Brian Henson himself as executive producer. For him, it was a chance to let those designs live again, to give the monsters new purpose instead of leaving them to decay in crates. For viewers, it was surreal. A cult fantasy villain reborn inside a space opera. A reminder that legends never really die. They just wait for the next stage light. Number 16. In 1983, a year after the movie's release, The Dark Crystal became something almost no one expected, a video game. Sierra Online, led by pioneering designer Roberta Williams, turned Thra into one of the earliest graphic adventure titles. Players guided Jen through puzzles and choices, navigating forests, caves, and Skeksis lairs. For its time, it was groundbreaking, winning awards for pushing the limits of home computers. Though primitive by today's standards, it carried something rare, the first attempt to expand Henson's fantasy world into interactive storytelling. Long before franchises routinely jumped to consoles, The Dark Crystal became digital myth. Number 17. Not long after the film's release, The Dark Crystal made the leap to the page. Marvel published a 2-part adaptation in 1982, filling panels with Skeksis, Mystics, and Gelflings in bold comic ink. For fans who wanted to revisit Thra at home, this was their only way before VHS. Decades later, the story returned. In 2017, Boom Studios released Power of the Dark Crystal, based on the unmade sequel that Henson had once dreamed of. For the first time, readers saw where the saga might have gone. With Thurma and Kensho at the heart of the story, the crystal cracked again, and new heroes rising in Thra. From Marvel's classic issues to modern reimaginings, the comics proved one thing. The Dark Crystal wasn't just a movie. It was a myth sturdy enough to be retold in any medium. Number 18. Henson wanted The Dark Crystal to feel like a storybook come to life. To achieve that, cinematographer Oswald Morris used a filter called Light Flex. It washed the film in a soft, glowing haze, as if every frame had been painted. This wasn't just technical trickery. It was a deliberate choice to match Brian Brian Froud's illustrations, where light blurred edges and colors bled together. The filter gave Thra an otherworldly texture, magical, but never fake. That fairy tale glow is why the film looks timeless today. It isn't sharp like modern CGI. It feels dreamlike, as if you've opened a book and stepped inside. Number 19. The Dark Crystal cost $15 million to make, a huge gamble for an all-puppet fantasy in 1982. It grossed about $40 million worldwide, which should have been a victory. But against Spielberg's E.T. the same year, it looked small. Critics were divided, some calling it too dark for children, too strange for adults. For Jim Henson, it was disheartening. He'd poured years and his own money into the film, only to see it dismissed as a curiosity. But time reversed the judgment. On VHS, cable replays, and eventually DVD, fans found it. Children who grew up with it spread its legend, and what once seemed a disappointment transformed into a cult treasure. The box office was a stumble. The legacy was immortality. Number 20. At first, critics didn't know what to do with The Dark Crystal. Too eerie for children, too odd for adults. But the film's artistry couldn't be denied. It was nominated for BAFTAs, Saturn Awards, and even a Hugo, rare recognition for a film made entirely of puppets. The craftsmanship of Thra, the technical ambition of its creatures, and the audacity of Henson's vision forced Hollywood to pay attention. It didn't sweep the Oscars, but it carved out respect in places where genre films were usually ignored. In the end, the awards weren't just about trophies. They were proof that what Henson built wasn't a novelty, it was cinema. Bonus fact, the Podlings, Thra's cheerful, rustic people, weren't based on elves, dwarves, or fairies. They were based on potatoes. Brian Froud sculpted their rounded faces and squat bodies to echo the humble crop, tying them directly to the soil of their world. It was a silly design choice, but it worked. The Podlings looked earthy, grounded, and endearing, perfect counterweights to the grotesque Skeksis. Where the villains embodied greed and decay, the Podlings embodied farming, community, and resilience. In a world filled with vulture lords and nightmare beasts, the potato people became the heart. The Dark Crystal wasn't safe. It wasn't simple. It was Jim Henson's darkest dream, a fairy tale carved out of fear, pain, and imagination. It gave us Skeksis rotting in their own greed, mystics shuffling toward balance, and Gelflings who carried the fate of a world in fragile hands. Critics wavered. The box office stumbled, but its strange beauty endured. Today, Thra lives on, in comics, in Netflix's revival, and in every filmmaker inspired by its audacity. If this story still haunts your memory, drop a comment. Tell us what legendary world we should journey into next. Because like the crystal itself, this film was fractured when it arrived, and only later did it shine.